sort of weirdly progressive for like Asian parents. They kind of encouraged me and my sister and I to like go into the arts, and I ended up taking more of like a conventional academic route through school of like focusing on like math and economics and things like that. But in general, like childhood was like super free, and we were sort of able to do what we want. We did grow up very privileged, so that gives you like a lot of flexibility in India. Like weirdly in India, like an observation I sort of made was uh, maybe it was some of the reasons why like grassroots cultures or like subcultures haven't really evolved in the same way as abroad is because just having you have to come from some level of privilege almost to have the flexibility to even try it. You know, because so many people who don't have that are sort of, parental pressure and like academic pressure, and there's like a set route if you have to be a doctor, lawyer, engineer. That's changing now, but a lot of the kids that I sort of grew up going to school with have sort of had to take a very conventional path. And I was very fortunate that my parents were sort of pretty open to me trying different things.
Yeah. That's interesting because, generally, it seems like in India and maybe Asia in general, your parents are pushing you to get into math or science, but you had parents that were trying to get you interested in arts, and then you still pursued economics.
That's the part that's wrong with me. I didn't take the exit that they were offering me. No, I'm going to study econ, but it was. I mean, that stuff still exists, irrespective of like, I would say they were like more lenient than most Asian parents, but those pressures still exist, and you still have to perform and stuff. But yeah, I was like a pretty big sports guy. I was not really into fashion or anything to do with what I'm currently doing until I was probably like 16 or 17. But before that, I was pretty much just like playing soccer and playing a little bit of cricket and just doing studies. So that was like the childhood, very like organized, regimented, but at the same time, like more freedom than the average kid.
Yeah. When you say that your parents, wanted you or were kind of pushing you into more artistic field, in what ways were they doing that?
So just like art classes or like stuff like that. There was a program that I did when I was like 13 maybe, which was called a partner or master program, where like a bunch of artists around India, like fine artists, would sort of give like a mentoring session for like once a week to a group of like 10 or 11 students. So I did that for like a couple of years. Just gave me like some exposure. And I kind of rejected it at the time, but looking back, it probably had some influence.
I feel like for me, I don't even know where I would have started, like in an artistic field if I was young. I kind of feel like I had to discover it for myself. Do you feel a bit the same?
Yeah, completely. Because I didn't study it. I studied economics at college. I studied econ and math and politics in high school as my subjects. And so, honestly, like the entry point was like Supreme. It was pretty much just like the sneaker Supreme, like the hype cycle. And I think slowly, I was never like a consumer of that, but I sort of had more esoteric interests, but used that as like a means to finance that, if that makes sense. And I feel like I think anyone under like 25 that's into this world is that's sort of their entry point. So it's the same with me. Supreme's a Comme des Garçons collab. What's Comme des Garçons? You go into a Dove Street market, you see like Craig Green and Dries Van Noten, and you're like, oh wow, like this whole world exists, and you can take your sort of world building elements to that level, and all that stuff just becomes pretty inspirational. And maybe just through osmosis, you're like, okay, I think there's a gap in the market, and I think I have a perspective that belongs here, and that sort of incentivized me to like take the risk and go for it.
Right. Did you discover Supreme and streetwear from India, or were you in the States once you had discovered it?
I went to boarding school. So I grew up in India. I still live here. I've lived here my whole life. But my parents sent me to boarding school in the UK when I was 16. And so there were a couple of kids that were already into it that I just became friends with. And that was sort of my entry point. But then I kind of just took it to like a very different nerdy level. And yeah, but Supreme and like flipping those shoes and flipping, that was when like Yeezy resale was crazy. This is 2016, 17 probably. And that's when you could just make so much money off like a Supreme bot as like a kid in your like boarding school dorm room. And I would just sell it to like rich Russian kids in school. And then use that money to like, actually I'd just save it up. I wouldn't even buy anything with it, but it would still like give you access or like sort of make you want to learn more about the cooler things.
Right. Do you remember the first Supreme piece that you bought or the first one that you resold?
Yeah, the first piece was like the North Face map jacket. Remember that one? Like that, they did that North Face collab. And then there was like the one with the hills. That one was there. I think the only piece I kept from that whole era that I still have is Supreme did like this Hindi script T-shirt that said skateboard in Hindi, and I still have that. But besides that, I kind of just flipped everything. I wasn't like interested in it as a consumer. I think it was more just like a case study in like consumerism and like how kids were sort of going in, sort of just getting so devoted to this community, and it didn't even seem like there was really a significant reason other than like finding some sense of like belonging or like being cool at school or whatever, It didn't.
Right.
The original message had sort of almost been lost, and that was interesting to me of like how some brands are able to like maintain this audience, some places where like the audience sort of controls where the brand goes.
Yeah.
And you just sort of see these different case studies and you're like, okay, this is it all sort of just to osmosis, even if you're not realizing it at the time, just sort of shapes your idea of what you would want to do.
Right. And I feel like streetwear was my entry point as well into fashion because I'm a few years older than you, but when I was a kid, Lil Wayne was my favorite artist, and he was wearing, Bape and all the, I don't know if he was wearing Supreme at the time, but Bape is what I remember most. I remember he was wearing these, pink and like baby blue camouflage full zip hoodies. And I felt like my brain exploded when I saw that, because I mean, for us,
Yeah.
I'd be curious to know this about you, but I know for me, my introduction to fashion was through, my favorite artists that I was, following at the time. But I think streetwear really is an introduction to a lot of kids into, more of the fashion with a capital F.
Yeah, no, that is interesting. Like for me, that almost happened for me more once I left India. Like to give you some reference, like in India, we didn't have like a lot of exposure to, like I think post 2016, maybe when like Netflix and things like that became super popular and Spotify and Apple Music came on, like just access changed, But before that, it was a little bit like you're in a bubble. But for me, like the Strokes are my favorite band of all time. So like people from that scene, like the Interpol to me is like the coolest band just because they always wore suits, and that commitment to like aesthetic is very interesting to me. So stuff like that, yeah, was definitely like an entry point. But I think the first thing that was like, oh, this is like what's happening here is a cultural movement almost to like get involved in was probably what my friends were doing with like skateboard brands and Supreme, Stussy, Palace, whatever. But like Palace was probably as big as Supreme at the time in the UK, and so that was like the entry point. And then as you sort of nerd out, and when you're 16, I don't even know if you have your own like defined taste. I think you're still figuring it out. Probably still am figuring it out. I'm like 23 now, so it was definitely like an evolution and just trying to gather as much information as I could back then.
Right. I'm really curious about your beginnings in general. You grew up outside of, are you in New Delhi? Is that where you grew up?
Yeah, I'm in Delhi. Yeah.
Tell me about, going to school and your friends and, kind of when you decided to eventually go to the States to study.
Yeah, I think so. A lot of kids from my school would go to the States. It was sort of like the aspirational path, It was like your way out almost. Or, I mean, recently, what's changed in India basically in the last five, I want to say 10 years, is the startup ecosystem. Like you can build brands as like a young person here, which wasn't the case growing up. So the idea was always like, the money is abroad, the opportunities abroad, the better education is abroad. And so sort of geared towards going there. And this is obviously, this isn't a generalization. Like it's a very small minority of people who sort of have access to those resources. But I was fortunate enough to be one of those. And back in India, it was like I think the big difference I noticed from like going to boarding school, which was like a super diverse environment because you had all these international kids, versus going to a government school in India where it was all kids are basically the same. Like even like personality wise, largely interchangeable. You could just, I think it just opened my eyes as to like, okay, you don't have to go down the set path of like running the rat race and going to a certain school. I still did it, but you don't have to do that, And I think that was very eye opening. Whereas in India, like that world just seemed pretty closed off. It was like, okay, you're gonna kill it academically, try to get into like an Ivy. If you don't get into like a top whatever school, go there, get an entry level job. And there's like everyone's geared towards a set path. But over there, and again, this is largely honestly a function of being around other people who also had privileged environments growing up. It sort of opened my eyes up to like, oh, okay, I can maybe take a risk here. With Karu, like the stakes aren't as high as I probably thought they were when I was just in India.
Right. Is Penn where you wanted to go, or did you have another school that you wanted to go to?
I needed to Columbia because it was in New York, and I think it aligned more with like the cultural stuff I was interested in. Like Philly's a complete sports town. It's not a lot of cool stuff happening in Philly. And when I went to Penn, it was actually like it wasn't super high on my list, but it was the best school I got into. And it's a great school. Like I really enjoyed my time there. Like it was, I was only there for 2.5 years because of COVID. The other time I finished my degree, but a lot of it was online, studying like night school while I was in India. But while I was there, it was a really good time. Loads of cool people. They're sort of going to be friends for life, I'd imagine.
Were you and your friends taking trips to New York, or I mean, you talk about visiting Dover Street Market and kind of jumping into the kind of fashion culture. Are there things you were doing throughout being at Penn that open your eyes more to that world?
So no, I didn't really find that community at Penn. Like most of my friends were like kids I play soccer with, or just like pretty like finance bro-y type people, like very fratty, and there weren't a lot of people interested in this stuff. Or if they were, like I did join like whatever the fashion club at your college is, or whatever, but it just wasn't what I was looking for. Like at all. That was like, write an article on like what kids are wearing on campus, which was like Canada Goose, Golden Goose, like that sort of stuff. It just wasn't interesting to me. Like it wasn't a community of people that I could sort of engage with. So I would kind of go to New York on my own, and I've sort of built a community of friends there just by going there. Like my friend Jake Booth, he used to run like Western Hydrodynamic Research, and now he was working at Sky High. Like him and I would hang out there and just sort of exchange ideas and like bounce ideas while I was developing what would eventually become like the more fully fledged version of Karu. It was already out. So I started Karu in my sophomore year of college. So it wasn't a lot of time before I sort of went all in on the brand. But yeah.
How were you in talking about building a community in New York? How were you doing that? How were you meeting people?
Uh, it wasn't a lot, honestly. Like most of the time, I was in Philly. In Philly, I had some cool people like Saeed from All Cap Studio and people like that. But uh, for the most part, it was just like a select few people. You go to like cool stores and whatever, but or like pop up events, things like that, meet people. But for the most part, like Karu was born out of complete working in isolation. Honestly, like it was not a community focused thing. It was me being in India on the other side of the world, kind of cut off from uh, most people sort of during COVID when 5, 6 months in had sort of gone back to campus. But I hadn't because I was sort of working on this idea. And I probably took a year of development of just like traveling to different artisans, seeing what the supply chain could be, seeing what was there. But it didn't really have much to do with like people that I was talking to in New York or in the States. It was really a function of me being on the other side of the world.
Yeah. I started iRay as well during the pandemic. What was it about that time off that really helped you develop the idea?
So I think it was I just had nothing to do, or nothing that I wanted to do. Like, I had a finance internship lined up that I was going to do at night. Well, like that sounded horrible. I had no interest in doing that at all. So it just made sense to like I've had this idea. I used to joke about it with my friends who are like more of the finance pro variety. Like, oh, I'm going to start this brand. It's going to be, da, 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 and they would just think I was lying. And then I was like, okay, now is it an opportunity to like actually try this? And it took a lot longer than I thought it would to like get the idea together because you get the wrong factory. You're in the search for the right factory, I should say, and you're searching for suppliers that will sort of listen to you as like a child, who's like, "Oh, I'll get you the order. Please just make the sample for me," and you're lying to them because you have no idea whether you'll actually get the order, but you're just hoping that people buy in. So it took a really long time, but the I would say I started concepting Karu probably like May 2020, launched the Instagram around like March 2021, and presented the first collection in June 21 in a virtual COVID showroom in London. But I'm sure you probably had a similar experience. Right? I'd be curious to hear that. Of like, it's like there's something freeing about just not having a commitment anymore, and just having that ability to say, okay, now, if not now, then when?
Right. Yeah. I think for me, it was a little different in that I felt like maybe in a way I was nearing the end of the road, which is that, I started making t-shirts when I was 18. So, I wanted to make clothing, but I was not exposed to much of the fashion world, and I didn't know if I could do it. So I just started with graphic t-shirts. And then it was actually in India. I was in Dehradun when I made my first cut and sew piece. I was just about to turn 21, but I was living in India for a couple months, and I went down to a local tailor in Dehradun. Some friends took me by, and I got to pick, the buttons and the collar shape and all of that. And I was like, I felt like my world had opened up. I was like, this is what I want to do. And so, that's what I wanted to do, but I wasn't sure how to do it. And, fast forward, I moved to LA because to me it was either LA or New York City. I didn't think about even going to Paris or London. And I so I had been developing a project since I was 18 under my, under a different name. And, so it was really like 10 years of really working hard on one idea. And COVID was the first time that, I was working retail, and we had to close the store. So I had a studio. I had a small studio, and it was the first time I got to go work there, for every day, all day, for 3 months. And so for me, COVID was really I was able to kind of meditate on my ideas. And I was like, everything I've done till now, hasn't worked so far. I really learned a lot those first 10 years just through failure. And I was like, okay, I'm letting go of trying to kind of make this happen. And I really want to put all my energy into making what I want to make. I felt like before, because my, part of finding your voice is just making things. And I know that's what you're saying as well. And I was making things that I thought people would like, as opposed to really diving deep within myself and exploring, kind of ideas that are further down into my spirit, I guess. And I think that's what COVID allowed me. It allowed me that space to really be like, I need to almost start over, take everything I've learned from these last 10 years. And that's why I say I started IRA during COVID, because even though it was work that I had been doing for a while, I felt like COVID allowed this new chapter of my life.
Yeah, that is interesting. Like it was definitely like a moment where you can definitely go one or two ways, like it's a real opportunity to like change the course, and I get what you're saying. Like it is, that is like the one silver lining from that horrible 2 years, but yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I really feel blessed that, I had that time, because it allowed me the space to work on my first IRA collection, which is what was first bought, by stores. But then also, in joining Paris Fashion Week, I think you had, because we did a presentation that was for fall 22. And I'm pretty sure that the only reason I got a slot on the calendar was that there were so many people that weren't traveling. And I was willing to, go and actually present something in person. And so, I feel like as small brands, we were able to really get a leg up because a lot of people weren't willing to travel, or they just couldn't travel.
Yeah, no, completely. And I mean, I didn't really do that much like formal presentation type stuff. I still have it, we just sort of put clothes in a showroom. But I think also stores were sort of looking for ways to drive traffic back into their stores, and just having the same brands probably wasn't going to cut that. So I think they were looking for diverse perspectives or like new aesthetics, and I think that really played into sort of the success that I think a lot of brands found in like sort of pandemic baby brands.
Right. How did you come up with the name Karu Research?
Yeah, the name was it. I was just googling like what artisan means in different like Indian languages. So Sanskrit artisan can mean Karu. It has like 10 different meanings, 10 different words for artisan. So it made sense to make like artisanal research. It was originally Karu MFG, but then I changed that a couple of months into Karu Research. And no, Karu just meant artisan. It sort of worked with my name. So I was like, okay, this has decent enough synergy to and the Instagram was available, the domain was available, the legal Zoom sort said that like it didn't conflict with anything. So yeah, it was. I just went with it, and I think it's like aged pretty well. Like I think it has a nice ring to it. The logo still looks good. Uh, Weirdly, I've seen like loads of other brands now co-opt research as the suffix. Not that they're necessarily influenced by Karu, but it's become like a thing that I definitely noticed. But at the time, I think it tied into the narrative of like, oh, we're sort of breathing new life into these heritage crafts.
Right. And the name also, it feels like it's the journey that you were on as well. I mean, you were kind of jumping in to find these craftspeople in your home country.
Yeah, and to an extent, it was like sort of the reason for starting Karu, if we take like a step back, was almost when I went abroad. When I was in India, there was like complete homogeneity. Like you don't notice the difference in being Indian because everyone's Indian. And when I went abroad, I sort of realized like we didn't have that much sort of high art cultural capital. Like Bollywood is this sort of ironic art form. The music hasn't really translated globally. It is starting to now in certain pockets, but it still isn't appreciated the same way a lot of like, other cultures have something. We just didn't have anything. And you'd go into the top stores and we just didn't have a brand there. And there was a way to sort of translate those aesthetics in my head where it made sense, and if it was like executed in the right way, like I thought we could build a brand. And so yeah, it was a sort of a process of me sort of trying to regain a sense of pride in my Indianness. Like for a while I struggled with that idea, and so sort of creating. It's almost like you want to prove that we can like make nice things. Like India isn't associated with that. Or if it is, it's like the validation comes from sort of Dries Van Noten doing their embroideries here or something. And even then, that like the idea of the global supply chain producing in India was hidden for a long time. So those narratives just didn't align in the way I wanted them to, and that process of then like going reconnecting with these cultural elements and um, engaging in like a very sort of sincere form of research was uh, sort of tied into the narrative, and I think it made for a more compelling story.
That's fascinating. So how much do you feel like your brand is about you accepting the kind of Indian traditional craft culture versus you kind of pushing the aesthetic a little further into what's more modern?
Yeah, it's a combination of both, really. Like the brand doesn't work if we don't modernize it, but at the same time, the brand also doesn't work if we don't work with the artisans, so it's really a function of both of those things. With the as far as like me being involved in it, it's not really like that autobiographical, as a brand. Like it is more about like a cultural mission, if anything. Like it's uh, there are elements where I can insert myself into the clothing, whether that's stories or embroideries or things I want to do. But for the most part, it's really a collaborative process, like in every element with the people that we work with.
Yeah, and you probably need that, right? Because I'm sure that the archive of some of these, artisans is insane.
It's unreal. Like it's actually unreal. So like if I sort of walk you through the process of like how a garment's made from like start to finish for us, like it starts off with like the traveling. Like I have to go. Like the last like Instagram post I made 2 days ago, I was traveling through rural Gujarat, and we work with like master weavers. So essentially, like a lot of these people are like national award winners that we're working with. They're very well respected, but I want to say 2000 onwards, their businesses really struggled because they just globalization happened. Foreign brands came into India. Indian brands pivoted to like foreign names and design languages. And there was like a complete delineation between what was like ethnic wear for like weddings and occasions and what people wore like day to day. And as a result, a lot of the people who aren't in like the embroidery sector, for example, their craft didn't maybe translate the same way it did pre-globalization, and they just got left way behind. So their archives, like some of them didn't even maintain them, you know? Like it's been a process of like working with them, like going through like their personal wardrobes almost, you know, saying, "Oh, this is really cool," and but the ones who have maintained them, and like the block printer I work with, who he only works with me and Yoji. It's unreal.
Amazing.
This guy, it took me so long to convince him to work with me. Like I just kept bothering him, kept bothering him. He was ignoring me, and eventually he's like, "Okay, fine, give you a shot." Now we've like really helped scale with them, but his archive is unbelievable. It goes back like 100 years,
Wow.
and it's all like tiny, maybe 3 centimeter by 3 centimeter swatches on like these old sort of recycled looking paper archives, and it's all stacked. It's not even in like a book or anything. It's kept under cloth in the block printing room. And I'll see if I have a photo. I'll share it with you. But that's like the best archiving I've seen. Sometimes it's just like, oh yeah, we did something like that, and it's this abstract idea. He'll like draw it out, and like, oh no, that's cool. Let's do that. And sometimes it's me going to them with an idea and saying, okay, how can we do this? And then the sort of the logistics and the back and forth of that is the collaborative process. And like, oh, we can do this, we can't do this, sort of thing.
Right. Is the artisan that you're talking about now, you said his archive goes back 100 years. Is it a family owned business, or what's the story with them?
Well, it's incredibly dynastic, the whole industry. The parents will do a great. So the weaver I was with, whatever, on Friday, he's 7 generations in into the
Wow.
craft. So,
It's
he
his
doesn't
whole
have like a,
life.
yeah, and never had a choice probably, and his kids probably don't have a choice, you know, but
Wow.
they love it. Or at least maybe they don't, maybe, but it's what they're just incredible at. There's like a natural gift that they have. But I mean, these businesses have now sort of, they're very small still, but they've scaled within the village to uh, like a top, like the big weaver in the village will have like 30 to 40 sub weavers, uh, with looms and like extensions of their houses, basically. But it's all incredibly small scale production, that's maintained largely through this sort of like artisanal pursuit of perfection more than like scaling a business. You know, it's a very different mindset. And sometimes there's like a weird disconnect with how I want to scale my business and just how we've sort of grown so quickly and how we have to keep up with demand, and how some of them are like, no, we're comfortable doing this. And I have to respect that, you know, like we don't want to hire 10 more weavers and train them. And like, this is what we're content with. And now I have to figure out like, okay, this is a limited edition piece essentially.
Right. Yeah, like you said, the mindset is so different. You know, what I noticed about being in India was that, you know, I spent most of my time in Kolkata, but, you know, I feel like there's a tailor on like every block, you know, whereas, and that the artisanal nature, that the customization that you can experience just as a regular citizen, you know, in India is normal. Whereas, you know, in the West, in the US, it's really about like streamlining the whole process. And
Yeah.
so I'm sure that felt daunting at first when you were like going in and you were trying to kind of like catch your breath onto where to start.
Yeah, it is. I guess like I heard someone else talk about it, but there's this idea of like the Indian dream, you know, like the American dream. Like you can actually just go and get stuff done here at a small scale, you know. Like from the start, we've been able to develop custom fabrics. That's unheard of for any young brand. Like fully custom fabrics developed from scratch. and we can develop like sample yardage of 20 meters, and that that just opens up doors that I don't think really you can do anywhere else. It's really like unique thing opportunity to have. But yeah, I think the in terms of like the consumer and the tailors, that's dying pretty significantly. But it's just about hanging about. Like there are a lot of people who still get their clothes custom tailored, and it does sustain that. Uh, but like so the in terms of like the tailoring and the production side, that's almost like different from the artisanal side. The artisanal element is mostly not done in urban areas. It's mostly rural, and you have to. They've almost like built their communities around the livelihood, so the whole village is involved in like a singular craft.
Mm.
And you can go there and just go from door to door and like figure it out. And it's really a function of like traveling and knocking on doors if you want to like work with them. You just have to go and do it. There's no registry, or you can't like Google. You can do a little bit on Instagram actually now, but for the most part, you have to sort of be willing to just sort of put the work in to go and meet them.
Right. So how did you start? I mean, take me back to COVID. You're home in Delhi, and what was your first? How did you find that first craftsperson?
The first one was, I think I went to a village called Bagru in Rajasthan. It's pretty popular one. It's a couple hours from Jaipur. But we had like really intense lockdown restrictions. So we sort of, I didn't even know how to drive at this time. I was 20 years old, yeah, and my mom drove me, and at every toll booths, like you had police officers saying, "Oh, where are you going?" Because you weren't allowed to leave your house at this time, and we just lied to them. And so we went on a grocery run or something. You just keep flying in the middle of nowhere, and we just sort of did stuff like that to get around. So we went to Bagru in Rajasthan. We went to a chicken curry artisan, which is like an embroidery technique in Uttar Pradesh. We went to a block printing artisan in Gujarat, literally just by driving, taking like road trips. And I'm very fortunate that my mom was like willing to do that for me. But it was, I think she also sort of really fell in love with the process as well over the course of that. But it was really, again, there was no registry or anything. It was word of mouth, like call one person to say, "Oh, can you recommend someone for this?" or something. You'd hope they know someone. You'd call them, ask for some photos on WhatsApp or something. You're like, "Oh, this looks interesting." Go meet them, develop that relationship. A lot of the times it doesn't work out, which can be like incredibly frustrating experience where they're just not interested in listening to what a 20-year-old has to say about, "Oh no, trust me, I'll get you your 200 meters minimum order quantity." But eventually, you just find people that are willing to take that bet on you, and luckily, just through like putting those hard yards in, we were able to do that.
Right. I love the idea of, I love thinking of you like driving around with your mom and you're like, oh, getting stopped by the police and like, "Oh no, we're going to our favorite chai spot. It's like 100 kilometers away."
Yeah, I'm not kidding. That's what we like faked like a pass. Like I went on like Photoshop and like literally faked like the gateway pass that allowed you to like travel from place to place, and just did it. Like it was that bootstrapped. There was no elegance to any of this at the start.
So you're like part fashion designer, part hacker, like selling off Supreme, like making fake. Are you making fake passports? And I'm just kidding.
Yeah,
like
no,
fake travel documents.
Yeah, don't worry about that one. But it's it is that. Like we have this word in Hindi called jugaad, which is basically just like figure it out, like hustle, figure it out. And that's how you do business here. Like that's the only way you can do it. And that's so true. Like it hasn't changed 3 years in. It's not gotten easier. If anything, we just do it with more people, but the process has stayed the same.
The personal relationship in India is one of the most important things. I mean, that kind of like that relationship, taking the time to speak with people, spending time with them in their studios. I'm sure it meant a lot to them and made a big difference that you were willing to show up and talk to them.
Yeah, I think they also want to know that you're like a real person. They're taking a risk as well, and by investing their time and giving loom space and things like that. So you developing that rapport is just sort of the bare minimum that you can do. And it's not like there are artisans that I've never met. There are like a few that I've just not interacted with. It's been entirely virtual. But the ones we work with mainly, friends of mine at this point.
Yeah. So just going back to the start, you're home during lockdowns, you're developing the brand, and then you end up going back to Penn, right?
Yeah.
So what did you do once you were at what point of the process were you in when you went back to the States?
That was when we were. So I went back to the States twice. I took a gap in between. So when we sold our first season in June 21, I didn't really know like how difficult producing something of that size is going to be. So like purely out of being naive, I guess, I went back and I was like, oh, I'll just work at night and figure it out. We fell behind on everything. Like it was a complete disaster. Because it is easy to like romanticize like the artisanal relationship. There's a couple of scumbags in there, that are really just in it for the money, and you have to sort of weed them out. Like with anything, it's a process. Like there was a guy who before I left, I'd sort of gone to him, agreed a price on a certain thing. He was like sourcing vintage Kantha quilts for me, right? And he just kept delivering quilts that were just not up to the standard. While I was in the US, I was like, what is happening over here? And so I'd get on the phone with him. We'd have like screaming matches, and he'd eventually be like, "Oh no, for the price you've agreed, this is the quality," which was not mentioned to me before. So it was a negotiating tactic to drive it up eventually and whatever. And I was back into a corner, sort of had to drive it up. But there are people like that, and so it was like an extremely difficult thing to produce that first season. And eventually, I had to take a gap semester in the spring to go back and deliver in March. Luckily, we like made up on like whatever time we lost and delivered. And then by the second time that I went, I got a couple of people involved in production management, so that it would. And a lot of it was honestly my mom helping me, but we got some people as well externally that would just make sure stuff was on time, because it's just hard to supervise like how I get swatches shipped to me and things like that, but then the lead time is kind of screwed up. Like everything has to move in like a very precise calendar for us to make this work, because nothing is vertically integrated. Our factory, or embroidery, or washing, marking, like everything is happening in different places. And then the artisanal supply chain of like fabric production is a completely different thing to that as well. So for everything to work, it is a logistical nightmare. And so I went back to the US, and because my parents were insisting that I do have to finish my degree. And eventually I did. We figured it out. It wasn't easy. I would basically work at pen stuff in the morning and Karu stuff at night, and sleep like 3-4 hours a night, and just get through it. But managed to eventually just like weather the storm.
Yeah. Production is, I think, for creatives, that's one of the hardest parts about what we do. How did you get introduced to your first showroom? So like you had pieces, because you don't come from a fashion background, right? So you're kind of developing a collection, and then are you just saying to yourself like, how do I get this out there?
Yeah. It was so I was just posting like one-off jackets on the Instagram. I didn't have enough stuff for a collection at that point, but I was also like, oh, I've spent 8 months working on this. I just need to launch an Instagram at this point, So I post one-offs. Some stylists picked it up, gained a little bit of traction there. I sent some to the Throwing Fits guys, James and Lawrence. I sent some to G and De Leon, and they posted it on stories, and an agent sort of just saw it on there and was like, oh, I think this looks good. Maybe you have something here. Let's get on a Zoom call. This is before a collection was made. So that was in March 2021. And he was he was hosting a COVID showroom in June. I hadn't even heard of any of the brands that he had. I had no clue whether, like, I didn't know anyone in the industry, like, quite frankly. Like, there was no one I could use as a reference or anything. I was like, dude, my clothes could just disappear over here if I send it to this guy. But he seemed nice, and his name's Greg. He runs an agency called DMSR, and we've been working together since. But I sent 21 pieces, and it was only like 7 patterns in the first collection, and only 21 pieces that we sent to Greg. And it was unbelievable. The first day, I get a message from Greg saying, right, Matches want it, Hen want it, Mr. Porter wanted it, Selfridges want it, Browns want it. I was like, what is happening here? Like, I had no idea that this was going to happen. We had shot a really nice lookbook, took a chance on a really good photographer, and I was confident in the clothes, but not that confident. Like, that was completely unbelievable to me. And yeah, it just blew past like the revenue number that I had set for it to be like a manageable hobby while I was in college. And at the end of that week, I was like, okay, no, this is what I'm doing now. College is sort of something to get through at this point. This is a business, and kind of just organically went from there. I don't know how Greg did it, but I'm very happy he did.
Yeah, the relationship piece of our industry is so important, right? I mean, because all of these, what I was doing when I started is I just was like trying every single email. I'd use like LinkedIn to try to like find who was at what stores. And then, and if you can imagine, there's probably like a lot of kids that were like me that are just like they're getting bombarded.
Did that work for you? Because it didn't for me. I tried it as well. It didn't work at all. I think I got one email response.
I mean, now I'm glad that it didn't work because, I think if my pieces that I was doing, before IRA would have like made it big, I don't think I would have really like been able to explore my full potential. But at the time, I wanted people to love what I was doing because more in a pure way. It wasn't really even about making money for me. It was more just like, I want to make things people love, And so doing that, it did help me get some meetings, but nothing ever really came from it. So, the relationship that a showroom has with the buyers is, I think, really important, especially for young brands.
Oh yeah, and it's so hard to find the right one. Like a lot of brands do, or like young designers do come to me and say, like, all right, can you like intro us to your showroom? Because it's just not an easy experience. Like, getting the right agent is, it's very difficult. Like, they have to have those relationships and then feel passionate about your brand. Like, the thing I always say to people is like, just wait for people to hit you up. You want them to represent you. If you go to them, like, maybe you luck out and find like the right guy, but it's you almost need them to feel equally as passionate about the brand as you do, and finding that person is not like a straightforward process.
Yeah, and I feel like you ended up finding a showroom that kind of has a good focus on the type of story that you're trying to tell.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it didn't clash with any of the brands that they already had. The one brand that I had heard of that they had was MF Pen at the time. And I was like, oh, that's a cool brand. I've heard Throwing Fits talk about it before. So I was like, oh, maybe there's something here. But no, it was genuine. It was a bit of a fire. Like, it was just no one else is hitting me up to represent me. And weirdly, the one email I got back when I was doing like those cold emails off LinkedIn, because I did the exact same thing, was from Travian, and it was like, oh, maybe you have something here. It never materialized to anything, but the best store in the world is the one that responded. But it was definitely just surprising. Like, I didn't even process what was happening. I didn't meet my agent till the 4th season that I did with him. in person, and I hadn't been to a Paris Fashion Week till season 4. Like I was just sending clothes, getting orders, and I was like, oh, this is pretty sweet. Like it's just happening pretty organically. Uh, it would be obviously it was incredibly stressful to produce those orders, but it was yeah, it was just like a kind of luck, I guess, or we were in the right position to be lucky or something, but it was very unexpected.
Yeah, so much of it is about timing, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah, completely. Like I almost feel like it's a combination of A, finding the right agency, B, the clothes being good enough, which is the most important thing, because no agent can sell a bad collection. But and then C, just like people being receptive to what you have to say. You know, you could be too early for your brand. Like that's a very possible thing. I think we just got the timing right, and I think we have sort of ridden that wave from that moment, pretty much.
Yeah. When you sold that first collection at the showroom, I mean, did you think that it was going to sell the way it did? Did you have like, were the pieces limited because of the fabric that you had? Did you have like a limit of what you could sell?
Yeah, I mean, it was like the business has been fully bootstrapped with $5,000. We've not put a penny more into that, so this is what I could do, you know, with that. And the lookbook, the models, the location, everything was. I styled it, directed it, everything, but the relied on favors for a lot of the things. But the everything was done at $5,000, so that's what we could do. And it was like I didn't know if I had a brand at that point. You know, I just had like a concept that I was working on, and so that felt like a low risk, sort of sensible enough number. My agent said maybe do like 35ish pieces. I ended up with like 21, but it just worked, man. Like and I think that is the strategy. Like my friends, Small Talk Studios, Nick and Phil in New York, they just moved to up in the same showroom in Paris, and they essentially did the same thing, like 20, 30 pieces, curated, very edited, and you know you want to demonstrate thoughtfulness. I think at the start when you're sort of pivoting to wholesale, and I think that's just a good way of like showing intentionality. Like you're not just putting anything out there. You're thinking this through.
Yeah. And I think when you're starting, not having a lot of money is actually really beneficial when you are building that first collection. Because my first collection for IRA, I think it was, I mean, maybe it was like 6 or 7 patterns, and it was like, 12 pieces or something. I mean, it was very small compared to like what I can do now.
Yeah. No, and it is like, then, I don't know, you just think about what those 7 patterns have to be, you know? Like, then naturally, I think now, like, I have so much freedom where, like, oh, I can take risks and maybe it works, maybe it doesn't, but the consequences aren't as high. When you're starting, yeah, I think having like those constraints and operating within like a certain framework is kind of beneficial.
Yeah. When you're building out your collections now, what are some of the challenges you face with your artisanal creators, and maybe with all of the techniques that you have available, how are you kind of honing it in to make a succinct collection?
I think part of the second part of that question is, yeah, like instinct. You know, you just kind of have to know what's right, when to use it. There's no exact science to that, but I don't limit the collection to like, oh, we can only use a certain number of techniques now because we're preserving something for future. If it works now, it works now. We'll figure out the future later. But I think, yeah, just have the general judgment of like what needs to be in it, what doesn't need to be in it. And sometimes you get it wrong, sometimes you get it right. That's part of the process. In terms of like the artisanal makers, that's not really the bottleneck. You know, because the fabric's incredible. Like it's what they can do is really special, and we kind of want to highlight that. I think one of the challenges has been we sort of fell in after the first 2 or 3 seasons into like, oh, we're selling like a shirt, a pant, a jacket, you know, like because we were operating on like 6 or 7 patterns. I was in college, so I couldn't like I wasn't full time, and in the studio designing, and I kind of had to make sure that we could produce this at the pace that we were growing. We kind of fell into that, and I think the last season was the first one that I designed full time, and that's the one that's going to be hitting stores in March. And then the one I'm working on now, we're introducing some women's wear, and so for me, it's just been a process of like developing the collections into like the full version of where I want to take them. And maybe that's not exactly what it's been for the past few seasons. Like the past few seasons have had some element of compromise, honestly, where you're just like, oh, this is what I can do, because I'm not in the country. I have to make sure that like these pieces can be produced and we can do like 100 of them, and just sort of figuring that out that leads to some elements of compromise. I'm sure even you have like a similar situation where it's like, I have these ideas, but when we get an order from whatever retailer, like we have to fulfill that, and there's like logistical constraints to that. But I think now we're finally getting to a point where it's more aligned with what I think the brand should be in its like purest form.
Yeah. When you're starting a collection, what is the starting point as far as the inspiration for you? Is it an idea about a cultural figure? I saw your one of your last collections, you kind of focused on like a cricket player. I mean, are you looking to cultural figures? Are you really starting with like, is it a fabric that you love and that inspires an idea? When you're facing that blank page, I'm curious to what you start with.
It's honestly a combination of all of those things. There is always like a narrative and like a research component in terms of what the direction has to be. So yeah, sometimes the reference point can be like, a certain style of architecture, and like the embroideries are maybe influenced by Mughal architecture one season, or it could be whatever. Like, or when there was a cricket player, there was more sportswear references, and looking at his wardrobe, and there was also like there's this king called Yashwantrao Holkar, who was like the Maharaja of Indore, a place in like the middle of the country, and he was like he's considered a bit of a ladies' man who used to like go to Paris and like buy velvet robes and dress like very extravagantly and had like all these crazy cars. He kind of like spent the family fortune on just like extravagant stuff, but as a result, like he had some really cool clothes, and I sort of referenced a lot of those in the previous collection. And then there used to be like a rock competition when in like the post Beatles coming to India, sort of in the 70s, in a place in the hills where like kids from the city would go, and these were like the first music festivals in India, and they couldn't really afford, or like maybe the market just wasn't there for like festival wear the same way there was at like Glastonbury or like Woodstock or something like that, and so the uniform was sort of a looser office shirt with a pleated trouser, and then maybe like a knitted beanie to add like some element of psychedelia. And that created like a very interesting uniform where you're juxtaposing like office tailoring with like hippie clothes, or like Beatles era psychedelia. And that contrast was super interesting. So that's influenced a couple of collections. And weirdly, we're sort of going back to that idea now in what I'm doing. Right now, there's also like Indian military references. So it could be any of those things. And then a lot of the collections like, oh, this is a nice fabric that we found in an archive. We put it in the collection. So it's a combination of both those things.
Does spirituality play a role in your design process?
Not really. I'm not very religious, honestly. Like, I feel like I should be, or like should say I am, because like it sort of feeds into the narrative. But honestly, I'm not a religious person. I didn't grow up in a very religious household. I think like I am like discovering some more elements of like what my spiritual beliefs are as like I become more of an adult. But right now, I don't have the time almost, to have a life outside of Karu and like develop these things. Like, to give you like some frame of reference, we hired our first employees who can like help me on like logistics and accounts payable and things like that. Take that stuff off my plate in June of this year. So till then it was like all me. And now since I've got those guys in, we're opening a store in Delhi, we're opening a store in New York, we're trying to do this Paris presentation. My schedule has been so fucked. Like it's actually, I've been operating on like 4 hours sleep for the past 3 years. But the as a result, like I just haven't been able to like travel on like personal journeys and like figure out stuff like that. It's something I want to do, but it just hasn't happened yet.
Yeah. I feel like the spiritual practice of India is always like that. There's a level of devotion, that happens in India, and which is why a lot of Westerners go there, right? I mean, that's part of the reason why the Beatles went.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I grew up in a Hindu household. I've done like the pilgrimages with the family, like as a kid. So I've been through it. I just never felt attached to it as a kid. And now, like, as an adult, you do kind of want to see what's out there almost. But yeah, right now it's just honestly been stuck in the office, stuck in the studio, just sort of grinding.
Yeah. Maria Grazia Chiuri from Dior, she just did one of her recent shows in Mumbai to pay homage really to the traditional craftspeople of India. Do you feel like there's a shift in focus in the fashion world to these Indian crafts?
Yeah, I think attention wise for sure, 100%. Like there's definitely more eyeballs on it. I think weirdly, like India has become like a very cool place to make clothes. There's a lot of brands making clothes here where you can kind of make stuff for like not a crazy amount of money, and it doesn't have like the xenophobic connotations that certain other countries have. Like that's the reality of it for being practical. But I think it is cool that these crafts are being highlighted. I think what I would where I sort of disengage from it is it's a very specific type of craft. Like it's mostly always embroideries. So a lot of the handloom weaving and sort of kanta embroidery and things like that kind of still are pretty undiscovered or underserviced. And then B, I think a lot of people get their samples made here with the full craft process, but I don't think they're getting their production runs done here. The production runs are a digitization of that process still. And as a result, like the economics aren't really affecting the artisans' pockets in the way that they should. Like for us, the sample is what you get in the store. Like the embroidery is still done by hand. And I get that like Dior maybe can't do that because they're huge and it's not a shot at them specifically. But there are a lot of brands that produce the samples here, get artisans involved. But then when it comes to making the process, sort of scaling that process up to wholesale or whatever, the direct to consumer, it's a digital print of a block print. It's a machine embroidery of what was once hand embroidery, and the artisan's not getting paid off that, you're not giving them royalties off like that stuff.
Right.
So eventually it doesn't really affect their lifestyle, or it doesn't help scale their businesses.
Right.
So that part is something that can still be improved.
And I feel like that's maybe our job as the next wave of designers is to kind of like focus on that quality. I mean, I know that's something for me that is very important. Like whatever is in the showroom is exactly what you're going to get, whether that's the fabric that you're, showing, or the hand stitching or the hand embroidery. For me, it's a key part of what I do that I'm going to do it exactly how I said I was going to do it.
Yeah, I think that's like the sincere way to do it. I agree. It is like a responsibility to sort of help highlight these crafts and then scale their businesses. Like the part of the reason why they're even working with us is because they've been suffered so much from like economic depression for years, and so there's a responsibility to help improve that. And I think also from like the consumer standpoint, like one of the reasons why I think Karu's worked is because it doesn't assume that the audience is stupid. Like you can create like a romantic narrative around craftsmanship or something, and then just like not work with the craftspeople, which I think a lot of brands do. And I don't want to name names, but I think people can sort of figure it out. But you can create that narrative around it, but realistically, what you're doing is what a fast fashion brand would do. You're just producing in a large enough factory and digitizing these artisanal small scale processes, and so. like the reason why the customer responds to maybe your brand, my brand, these brands that are actually working with artisans, is because they go, you can feel it, like this was handmade, it's imperfect, and that's sort of the appeal. And it gives a lot of credit to the consumer to sort of figure that out and see what the value is. And I think that's a super important process.
I feel like India was the place where, for me, it was almost the foundation to my aesthetic now, and really exploring that human touch. Because when I went, the first time I went, I was 13, and I remember just the rawness of the city, you're driving by the concrete buildings that are half finished, and you have the metal sticking out of the walls, and you have, the rebar. You have the faded paint on the side of the buildings. And I really felt like, although it was a culture shock for me, I felt like that really kind of inspired what I do now. And I think there's a huge opportunity in our industry for focusing on the human touch as opposed to the pursuit of perfection.
Yeah, no, I would almost say growing up, that sort of, you'd look at the West and you'd be like, why can't we have that? But now, like as an adult or as someone who works in the industry, there's almost like it shouldn't work any other way. It wouldn't work any other way. Like there's this idea of like intentional imperfectness, like it's like an extension of like wabi sabi, I guess. But there's a reason why there's a balance to the chaos, and anything else would just not work, and it shouldn't work. And finding the beauty in that, whether that's literally like looking through a building or the organization of a city, or in like a more literal manifestation of like the embroidery and like how no two flowers are going to look the same. Part of that is, I think, what appeals to me about it, and I think it's what appeals to the consumer as well.
Yeah. Do you feel that the economic boom that's been happening in India for the last 5 or 10 years, now that you're back there after spending some time in the States, are you seeing that impact within the fashion aspect as well, or is it more in the livelihood of what's going on?
No, it's definitely impacting it, but I think it's for maybe like the top 5% of income earners is where you're noticing a difference, and which is a relatively very small percentage of people. I think a couple of the differences are like, I don't think people in general, irrespective of income group, feel like, because the economy is developing so fast and taste levels are evolving so fast now, you don't have to, like, good service is not really like a luxury thing anymore for the first time, And so there is a democratization of that, which is interesting. And that's affecting a lot of different income groups. But I think in terms of like consumerism and like luxury and fashion and things like that, you are noticing a big change in the top income earners and how they're spending. They are spending a lot more. There's a lot of disposable income, a lot of black money, like stuff that's being hidden from the government and stuff like that, that's being spent at these malls. You go to like the mall in India, in Delhi, where like Louis Vuitton, Dior, whatever. It's nuts. Like there's a line outside every store. It's kind of crazy. It hasn't manifested in like supporting Indian brands. There is a disconnect right now where people aren't necessarily, they're influenced by things that don't necessarily align with the craftsmanship or national pride and things like that. Outside of weddings, at weddings they'll spend anything, but outside of that, it's all like Louis Vuitton screen printed T-shirts, Gucci hoodies, like luxury designer sneakers. You are noticing like a streetwear 1.0 thing happening for the first time. Like there are streetwear brands that are putting up serious numbers. And there's like youth cultural movement, but weirdly, it's not affiliated to a subculture. It's streetwear for the sake of streetwear, if that makes sense. Like it's what makes it cool is that it's limited. There's no reference point.
Yeah, it's
so
about
there are
the
these
name.
like weird things. Yeah, there's these weird things that are happening, and it is exciting. I think like as a young brand, like on the precipice of potentially scaling in India, it is like there is a future that I look at. I'm like, oh, this could be something, like a domestic market that does support its own brands. But I think like speaking to like Korean designers at the LVMH prize and things like that, the Korean market's not really supporting their brands, and their brands are like really fleshed out. There's a lot of really good Korean brands. Like in India, we don't have a lot of good brands that are young. Like I would say there's maybe like two or three. But there, that switch hasn't flipped. Like the consumer in Korea is gravitating towards foreign brands, and Korean brands are finding more success abroad. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with India with this.
Do you feel like there's going to be a shift soon in India with supporting Indian designers like yourself? Or do you feel like as a whole, you're maybe a few years away from, your community in India supporting you there?
I think there's not a lot of people who can afford Karu that are young. So essentially, like the under 30 young professional is not a luxury consumer in India. It's mostly like family businesses and their kids. So it's like a private client business almost. At least right now. Maybe that changes. I think part of it is also access. We don't have a good multi-brand. Like the idea of like a curated DSM or something like that doesn't even exist in India right now. It's very like luxury brand, mass market, and no curated indie thing. So I just got possession of my first store today. Actually, we're going to build it out in Delhi, which will be like a curated multi-brand where I want to bring in a few international designers, have a Karu space, have like more of like a streetwear space for me to like mess around with, and just have like something with integrity. And I think maybe once that opens, something can change. But until that happens, I don't really have like a definitive answer for you.
That's awesome. Congratulations.
Thank you. Yeah.
What was the inspiration behind doing a multi-brand store in Delhi?
It just felt like it was needed. Like I don't shop in Delhi. When I'm here, I don't spend my money on any other clothes. And so I was like, oh, why don't I just create something where people like me can buy clothes? It's a bet. It's a complete bet. The rents are pretty cheap, so it's not like a huge risk. But I just want to try, see what works. We're also opening a New York store within the next 5 or 6 months. That's the one where I'm like, that needs to work financially because it's more of a commitment, But that'll be a Karu store, not a multi-brand. But the Delhi store is something that is almost more of like a research lab. I'm actually not even calling it Karu. I'm calling it research. And it's going to be like this weird space where I can just have just bring in stuff that I like. And honestly, for the most part, it'll just be like friends of mine shipping stuff in and us selling it.
Yeah, and in a way, it sounds like that's kind of a way that you can give back to your city, which is really just kind of about bringing the exposure to these other brands that are around the world.
Yeah, I think it'll be cool. I'm excited. Like I'm very nervous about it, but at the same time, I think there is something like it's not some like VC backed like corporate thing where like, oh, we're bringing Chanel to India and it's going to generate this hype. So no, it's not supposed to be that. It's just like it's a cool thing that it's community driven where we have events every week or 2 weeks and just create some sort of culture around brands. Maybe like start just in-house IP. Like maybe that's the future of that. Just keep starting like sub brands. You know how like mountain research or like general research would just start like 10 different brands and it would like last for 2 months and then just disappear. Like I think like that would be so cool to just have something like that. That if it works, it works. If it doesn't, it doesn't. But it's a very low stakes environment.
Yeah, and it gives you a playground to be able to explore those ideas.
Exactly. Yeah. Like we don't have a Gorp brand in India. Like the idea I've been working on is like this idea of like a natural Gorp where you're sort of combining like hippie Kuji knits with like technical fabrics and like natural pants. Like I think that aesthetic could work globally, and it's just about almost like the end game for research to me would sort of be if I can have like a couple of people that I can train as like originally working for Karu, and then they start their own brands and we sort of fund that and produce it and eventually have like this ecosystem of Indian brands, kind of how DSM did it for at the start, like Junior, Sakai, whatever, and now they're doing it for a bunch of American brands. But to do that for India would be a really cool thing, I think.
Yeah, and it seems like you're the guy to do it too. No, that's really incredible.
I hope so. I'm not like super tapped into like the local community here, but I think this would also be a way of doing that for me.
Yeah, but it's about the exploration, right? I mean,
yeah.
I think it's up to us to really like kind of own what it is that we want to do, even if no one gives us permission to do it.
Yeah, no, completely. And I think that is honestly way easier to do in India than it is to do in the States, because like everything's new here, like there's something exciting about that. Like you're the first to bring this concept, and that can be a good thing or a bad thing. You could be too early, but at the same time, if it lands, you could have something big.
Yeah, that's awesome, Kartik. Congrats. I'm excited to see how the store looks. When are you planning to open the Delhi one?
So the contractors are going to be in post Diwali. Nothing's happening this week because of Diwali, but I mean, I'm still working, but basically all the furniture makers and everything are pretty chill right now. In India, 2 months means 4 months. So we're going to try for January, end up in March, probably.
Yeah. No, that's so true though about the timing.
Yeah.
I think that's really with everything though, not just in India.
Yeah. In India, but like time just feels like a very abstract concept. Like it's just like, oh, when it happens, it'll happen, yeah, I'd still have all my hair if stuff worked on time. But yeah, it's very, very strange.
Yeah. I saw recently that you worked with, and forgive me if I get the name wrong, but Abhishek Kedekar, the photographer for Hypebeast. They go by Tender Coconut on Instagram, but I'm familiar with his work. But I'm curious if starting Karu Research has introduced you to other Indian artists that you otherwise wouldn't have had the opportunity to work with.
Oh yeah, 100%. Like it's been, well, I think so. Abhishek shot my SS24 lookbook before that, and he's just super talented, and so, but just wasn't getting like that much commercial work. He's like more of a documentary photographer, and I think the platform that Karu has, like, we can sort of spotlight talent in a way that a lot of other brands can't in India. So the first photographer that we worked with, and the guy who's now doing the videos for Karu, is this guy called Devashish. And again, same thing. He was like an apprentice to a big photographer, and we kind of just gave him an opportunity to go crazy, and he killed it. So I think that process has been really cool. But that's all the credit to them, really. Like they're very good at what they do. It just hadn't been highlighted in the right way, and so that's been really interesting. I think a lot of them are also like under 30, which is also cool to work with young people. There's a lot of talent here. Just maybe the reference point hasn't been there, or the exposure hasn't been there, or people just haven't been looking. So it's something that I'm trying to do more of. But as an indie brand, you have your constraints.
Of course, yeah. Last question, for the young creative that could be listening, what advice would you give them in starting their own brand?
Ooh, where do you start? But I think the first thing is like really go through the concept. Like that's so important. Like there should be no rush to go to market. Like genuinely, like think about it fully until you have like this unique thing. Like we don't need another ALD. And so I think just the idea of like really honing in on like what your perspective is, it'll pay off in the long run. You don't have to launch in 3 months. It'll take a year, figure it out, and I'm sure like the brand will be better off for it. And then the second thing is if you're a young person, like just take that risk. Like go for it. What's the worst thing that can happen? Just get a job like 2 years down the line. Like it's. I think that's the biggest thing that I had to get my head around. Like all my friends were on this path to like Goldman and Lazard, and they're making like 200K out of college, and sort of foregoing that, or like, I mean, we do pretty well with Karu, but it's just like there's a chance that it doesn't go well, and taking that risk and being comfortable with that, like the stakes aren't that high. You can pivot, you can figure it out. But just if you believe in it, just take that risk.